Last time we discussed, I'm trying out this new handy-dandy mic, and I'm quite happy with it, actually. Last time we discussed the role of race in health treatments and outcomes. We talked about the causal role of race, if any, and if so, where. We talked about ways of distinguishing different kinds of disparities. We talked about the role of ethnically patterned patient preferences and the role of physician decision-making and geography in race-based differences in health. Now, let's refresh our memory about different ways of defining health and of defining medical conditions. So we introduced a few times ago this notion that one way is the statistical standard, which compares people to their peers. We introduced this notion of the adaptive standard, which compares people to their environment. And we introduced as well the notion of the normative standard, which compares people to ideas. And note that the normative standard is not the same as the normality or statistical standard, which is first on the list. And another way to understand the normative standard is to say that illness and disease are socially constructed. Now, the social construction of illness is the opposite of essentialism and of positivism, which see social and biological phenomena as given and measurable entities and which claim that the truth is knowable. So the argument with respect to social construction is that observations are actively and creatively produced by human beings. We ourselves observe the world, and in that observation process, we make the world, is the argument. The idea is that knowledge is created, not found. Ideas and actions are made or invented and determined by communal norms and expectations. This is the concept of social construction. Hence, social forces shape our understanding of and actions towards illness and health. Now, to the extent that this is the case, then that means that social attributes, such as class, should also be relevant to how ostensibly objective biological phenomena are seen, taxonomized, understood, and treated. Moreover, the fact that illness and our perceptions of bodily processes are socially constructed has implications for patient experience and physician action. And that's the key point I'm going to make in the lecture today. That this idea of social construction of illness is not idle, because after we construct illnesses in ways that I'll be describing today, we then take action accordingly. So it matters. The extent to which we determine knowledge matters a lot in how we treat patients. Now, to punch this point home and to motivate the discussion for today, I thought I would start with considering some related problems. Now, here is the familiar visual part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we know as light, and with the familiar rainbow colors. And the colors are listed on the bottom, and I want to draw your attention to two facts about this. First of all, you probably all feel, with a possible exception of indigo, that all these color names make sense, and they are real colors. And in fact, you would also probably think that there are a certain number of colors, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And you would also probably agree, first point. So the first point is that these colors make sense, and that there are a certain number of colors in the visual part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Second, and distinctly, you would probably all agree, roughly speaking, on where the names are placed, so that you all see green as ending here and blue as starting there, more or less. But there's actually very little that is objective about both of these, both about the number of colors we perceive and about the boundaries we draw between them. For example, the number of colors we identify might depend on other attributes, like our sex, for example. So it might be the case that how you divide the spectrum and where you draw the boundaries might vary according to your gender. But let's look at some experimental results from a large-scale, worldwide investigation. Now, on the top is a standard set of stimuli that was used in the so-called World Color Survey, showing a palette of 330 colors, and these 330 colors were put on little chips, and one at a time, apart from all the other colors, so that each person was shown one chip, one at a time. Every one of these 330 chips was shown to people who speak, native speakers of 110 languages in non-industrialized societies. So the people took these chips, they went to 110 societies around the world, and one at a time they showed each chip to groups of people from each of these countries. And the investigators recorded the color term that was assigned to each of the 330 chips by the largest number of speakers in each language, resulting in what is known as a mode map, such that, as shown in the lower category, such as the following. So in the lower group here shows the mode map for speakers of the language Lele, and it says that, okay, when they were shown this chip right here, they said it was yellow, but this chip they said it was white, and this chip they said it was red, and this chip they said it was black, and this is the mode map for the language, what the colors that were perceived, and where the boundaries were drawn for the speakers of this language. So the recognition of colors is at least partially socially constructed and transcends the physics of the situation. People, Lele speakers, have different colors than we do. They only have 4 colors, white, yellow, red, and black. And they divide the colors in this way as shown here. And the key further point that we're going to explore today is that once these mode maps are constructed, these categories can then have effects. So there's something known as the controversial Whorf hypothesis, W-H-O-R-F, that was propounded in the 1950s, and that holds that semantic differences between language, so the differences between language and what colors are named, if you will, can induce differences in perception and or cognition. And this idea has a checkered history, but it's been resurrected of late. And the claim is that linguistically coded color categories induce actual differences in color discrimination. The idea is that if you grow up in a society which has just 4 colors and maps them this way, you might be less able to distinguish, let's say, orange from yellow, or recognize blue and green, distinguish blue from green, because you grew up in a way that presented you with this kind of way of partitioning the visual part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, here are some examples of people or groups who identify 3 colors and where they draw the line. So this is white, red, and black are the only 3 color names that these populations have. This is in the Wobe people of Ivory Coast, the Bete people of Ivory Coast, and the Ejagama people of Nigeria and Cameroon. But they don't all draw them in the same location. So there's a little difference. Like this color would be named red by these people, but black by these people, and so forth. And here's what happens. Here's some populations that identify 5 colors and where they draw the boundaries: yellow, green, red, black, and white. And they're spread out on different locations in Papua New Guinea, in Ecuador, 2 different groups, for example. And here are examples of people who identify 6 colors and where they draw the boundaries. And it turns out that the blue-green distinction is a key one here amongst these populations. So the blue and green are kind of drawn, the boundary is drawn in a very distinctive way. Now, to be clear, the issue here is also whether these people even see the differences between blue and green, for example, or orange and yellow. So do you see the difference between shades of green, or do the conventions in your society in which you were raised contribute to your failing to distinguish, that is to say, even see these differences? And there is some evidence for the latter, that if you grow up in a society that has a different kind of linguistic construction and partition of the electromagnetic spectrum of the visual part, you then are less able, your brain is entrained, you are less able to see these differences between these colors. So color would be socially constructed. Or consider the work of Lira Broditsky, who has done some work on the way the Kuuk-Thaayorre, who are a group of Aboriginal people in Australia, talk about space. Now, instead of what all of us regard as the conventional ways of partitioning space, right, left, forward, and back, the Kuuk-Thaayorre used cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. And that means when they're speaking to you, they would say, there's an ant on the northeast foot, on your northeast foot. Or they would say, move the cup on the table a little bit south-southwest on the table. So the growing up in a society in which the description of the position of things in space requires you to be constantly oriented with respect to the cardinal directions, it is argued, makes you a kind of superhuman navigator. That if you have to do that if you grow up in a way in which that's the way you speak about the world, you acquire or have navigational abilities that astound people like us. And in fact, this results in a profound difference in navigational ability and spatial knowledge between speakers of such languages that rely primarily on absolute reference frames and languages that rely on relative reference frames like English. In fact, speakers of languages like the Kuxayore are much better than English speakers at staying oriented and keeping track of where they are, even in unfamiliar landscapes or strange buildings. If I take you to a strange building and walk you through the building, you can get disoriented much more easily than someone that grew up speaking this language. Having their attention trained in this way equips these individuals to perform sort of navigational feats sort of beyond what are ordinarily seen as human capabilities. Now, as linguist Roman Jacobson pointed out, languages differ essentially in what they must convey, but not in what they may convey. Languages can oblige the users to think in particular ways, and because space is such a fundamental domain of thought, differences in how people think about space don't end just with space. People rely, you see, on their spatial knowledge to build other, more complex, more abstract representations such as time, for example. So if the Kuxayore think differently about space, do they also think differently about other things like time? And so to test this idea, Boroditsky gave people sets of pictures that showed some kind of temporal progression. For example, pictures of a man aging, or pictures of a crocodile growing and getting bigger, or pictures of a banana being eaten. And she gave these pictures, this sequence of little photographs, to speakers of different languages and asked them to arrange them in chronological order. Now, if I handed you a deck of such cards, you would sit at a table and you would orient them from left to right. This is the youngest person, then the next youngest, and so forth. Or here's the whole banana, and the banana's being eaten. But if you give them to the Kuxayore, they don't do that. They actually orient them from far left to far right. I'm sorry. They actually orient them. I have to find the direction because I don't remember which direction they orient them in. From east to west. So the Kuxayore orient the cards from east to west, but how they lay them on the table depends on their orientation. So if they're facing north, then they put the cards left to right, but if they're facing south, they put the cards right to left. And if they're facing in some other direction, they put the cards heading away from their body, and still another direction, they put the cards coming from their body. So the cards are arrayed always in the east to west orientation for the cards, but with respect to the body of the person laying out the cards, they assume different orientations. Whereas you would lay out the cards left to right, no matter how I rotate you, you always would array the cards left to right. So they spontaneously use this spatial orientation to reconstruct or construct their representations of time. So language affects their thinking, but also their actions. Here how they go about ordering these cards. Or still another example of how language can affect thought and action. Languages, in fact, differ widely in the ways they encode time and not just space. For example, they differ in when they require speakers to specify the timing of events or when timing is left unsaid. For example, if I wanted to explain to an English-speaking colleague why, if you wanted to explain to an English-speaking colleague why you couldn't attend a meeting later today, you might say, you would not say, I go to a seminar. English grammar would oblige you to say, I will go, or am going, or have to go to a seminar. But if, on the other hand, you were speaking Mandarin, it would be quite natural for me to omit any marker of future time and say in Chinese, I go listen seminar. And in this way, English forces its speakers to habitually divide time between present and future in a way that Mandarin, which has no tenses, does not. And of course, this does not mean that Mandarin speakers are unable, or even less able, to understand the difference between the present and the future, only that they are not required to attend to this difference every time they speak. And so economists, and these types of languages can then be divided into future time reference languages or not. So there are future time reference languages and those that are not. And the question is, well, if you are a speaker of such a language, does it, for example, affect your health behaviors or your savings? If you're not constantly reminded that the future exists every time you speak, are you less likely to save money for the future? Or are you more reckless with your health behaviors? So Keith Chen tested this idea that languages that grammatically associate the future and the present, whether they foster future-oriented behavior or not. And he found that speakers of such languages save more, retire with more wealth, smoke less, practice safer sex, and are less obese. And this holds both across countries and within countries when comparing demographically similar native groups. So in this slide, the light bar countries speak weak future time reference languages, and the dark bar countries speak future ones. And if you average across the light bar countries and the dark bar countries, you find that the total savings rate is higher in the dark bar countries than in the light bar countries. Okay? So here's another example of how language constructs action, affects what you do. Our third example shown so far. So something like these ideas is at work in medicine. And let's start with plastic surgery. Whether you judge a nose to be in need of medical attention depends not just on the objective reality, but on the social norms. And I think something like 0.5% of you thought that a large nose was a medical problem, and only 3% of you thought that it was a concern of doctors. And yet we all know that rhinoplasty is a huge business in the United States. Billions of dollars are spent on nose procedures every year, and this young woman also, for example, wanted her nose adjusted. And this boy is so much happier with his ears after they've been fixed, right? So here, people might have called this poor boy wingnut or something like that when he was in elementary school, and he's not so happy here, but then afterwards, look at the smiling young man. His ears have had a procedure known as a setback otoplasty. His ears were put back. So we construct our ideas about what our bodies should be like. We see our bodies in a particular way, and then we deploy medical technologies accordingly. Because we see something as being a little unusual about this boy's ears, he has surgery. We cut him. We do something to his body because of the way we construct the world. There's nothing objective about where the ears are. We declare that ears of this kind are problematic, and therefore we intervene in this young man's body. Now today we're going to be examining this idea of social construction mostly through the lens of women's health and Emily Martin's remarkable book, which was assigned for today. And I should stress that this is not restricted to this set of issues is not restricted to women's health issues, though this is a particularly rich example. Now this is the typical diagram of the menstrual cycle, probably familiar to all of you from high school. And it walks you through the various phases where you get the estrogen bump, and then the later progesterone bump, and here is the stages of follicular development, and then the mature egg is released right here in the middle of the cycle. This is what's happening to endometrial growth over the 28 days. Here you get proliferation phase, where the endometrial lining is proliferating, then a secretion phase, and then a shedding phase, which constitutes menstruation. And a typical example of this might be as follows. Here's one textbook definition or description of menstruation. The sudden lack of these two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, causes the blood vessels of the endometrium to become spastic, so that blood flow to the surface layers of the endometrium almost ceases. As a result, much of the endometrial tissue dies and sloughs into the uterine cavity. Then, small amounts of blood ooze from the denuded endometrial wall, causing a blood loss of about 50 milliliters during the next few days. The sloughed endometrial tissue plus the blood and much serous exudate from the denuded uterine surface, altogether called the menstruum, is gradually expelled by intermittent contractions of the uterine muscle for about 3 to 5 days. This process is called menstruation. And all of you have probably read these descriptions in your biology textbooks or other places, or seen images like the one I just showed you and accepted them in a relatively unquestioning way. But of course, in this description, note all the decay and failure, lack and spasm and ceasing and dying and sloughing and oozing and denuding and more loss and more sloughing and more denuding and finally expulsion. So, these words are loaded words. They're not sort of objective words. And these words can then go on to construct not only how we see the process of menstruation, but here's the kicker, what we do about it. They're not idle kind of linguistic conceits. They affect not how we perceive the world and how we act on it. Now contrast this with the process of failed reproduction in men. The mechanism which guides the remarkable cellular transformation from spermatid to mature sperm remains uncertain. Perhaps the most amazing characteristic of spermatogenesis is its sheer magnitude. The normal human male may manufacture several hundred million sperm per day. Wow! This is described as this most remarkable, amazing achievement. And there's no discussion here about the waste of sperm or spillage or sloughing or expulsion. You know, you get no other words like that when you're discussing spermatogenesis. And contrast these two processes, how they're described in textbooks, with similar but not identical physiologic process that occurs in both men and women. So Martin is making her argument. She's saying, look, the way we talk about menstruation is not coincidence, or it's not irrelevant. And it's different than the way we talk about spermatogenesis. And you might say, well, but those are totally different physiologic processes. They're so different from each other, it's really not a fair comparison. She says, well, let's pick a process that occurs in both men and women. How is that described? Which it might be similar, and but not identical. And here's how the renewal of the gastric epithelium is described. The primary function of the gastric secretions is to begin the digestion of proteins. Unfortunately, though, the wall of the stomach is itself constructed mainly of smooth muscle, which itself is mainly protein. Therefore, the surface of the stomach must be exceptionally well protected at all times against its own digestion. This function is performed mainly by mucus that is secreted in great abundance in all parts of the stomach. The entire surface of the stomach is covered by a layer of very small mucus cells, which themselves are composed almost entirely of mucus. This mucus prevents gastric secretions from ever touching the deeper layers of the stomach wall. And the point here is that the way we see menstruation, the fact that we see it in a particular way and we describe it in a particular way, are related, and they are not arbitrary. And as we shall see, such views of bodily processes have implications. Now, when I first read Emily Martin's book, when I was approximately your stage of life, I was a little persuaded when I got to this part in the book, but not yet entirely persuaded by her argument. And then she did something which just was like a bullet in my brain. It was just like, oh my God, I see what she means. Because she didn't just stop short at describing these different ways, she proposed an alternative way that you could go about it, describing menstruation that was just as scientifically, objectively accurate, but that was completely different. So she goes further. She provides a physiologically accurate but socially reconstructed way of describing the same phenomenon. Here's her description of menstruation. A drop in the formerly high levels of progesterone and estrogen creates the appropriate environment for reducing the excess layers of endometrial tissue. Constriction of capillary blood vessels causes a lower level of oxygen and nutrients and paves the way for a vigorous production of menstrual fluids. As part of the renewal of the remaining endometrium, the capillaries begin to reopen, contributing some blood and serous fluid to the volume of endometrial material already beginning to flow. And the point here, of course, is that conditions are judged by a normative standard. Whether we see something as pathological can depend on who we are, where we stand, and when we are living. And you actually showed this yourselves in the exercise that you did for the class today, which we collated last night. Here's some initial ways that you construct illness. So less than 0.5% of you think that large nose is a disease, 2% think it's a concern of doctors, 1% of you think that homosexuality is a disease. I don't have much to say to you guys. 4% think that it's a concern of doctors. 10% of you think that road rage is a disease, 24% of doctors. 16% of you think that PMS is a disease, but half of you think doctors should be concerned about PMS. Back pain, 32% think that it's a disease. 84% think doctors should be worried about it. Acne, 29% of you think acne is a disease. You're still close to that period of your lives, probably. 69% of you think it's a concern of doctors. 58% for obesity. 95% think it's a concern of doctors. Think obesity is a concern. ADHD, 55 and 81. Alcoholism, 68 and 86. Hay fever, 75% of you think hay fever is a disease, and 90% of you think it's a concern of doctors. And finally, for anorexia, as is shown at the bottom. Now, you don't all agree, though, right? There's tremendous variation. Some of these things, half of you think it's a disease, half of you don't. Half of you think doctors should be concerned of it, half of you do not. And even though rhinoplasty is one of the most common surgical procedures, you did not consider having a big nose to be a problem, but having a big body certainly hit your radar screens. And as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, some of these conditions, such as back pain and anorexia, show substantial cross-cultural variation and might not be considered diseases at all elsewhere. In fact, they might not even exist in other societies. Just like people don't see different colors, they might not see different diseases because they weren't raised in a place which drew the boundaries and labeled these as conditions. It's as if the absence of a category suppresses the occurrence of an illness and vice versa. Now, labels are sometimes applied by physicians and are the products of expert knowledge, and sometimes they are sought by patients. But with which definition of health, but the question is, which definition of health can be used to create sort of contested labels? For example, in PMS and ADHD and hay fever, we see a tension between the normative and statistical definitions of health. Because how can a majority of the people be labeled ill? So for example, conditions like PMS, which strike most women, and hay fever, which strike most people, and ADHD, which allegedly are striking most boys in schools nowadays, if that's the case, how can we be labeling more than half the population as having a disease? We say, oh my goodness, all of you have a disease. That's a kind of tension between the social construction of illness, the normative standard, and the statistical standard of illness. And you guys were all over the map in your perceptions of what constituted disease and needed the attention of doctors. So you varied, for example. These are all things I picked where there was half of you thought it was a disease or half of you thought it was a concern of doctors. So childhood short stature, only 13% of you thought it was a disease, but half of you thought doctors should be concerned. PMS we already saw. Color blindness, a significant fraction of you thought it was a disease and a concern of doctors. Pedophilia, 37%, only 37% thought it was a disease. Half thought doctors should do something about it. Cocaine overdose, only half of you thought it was a disease. And I don't know who the 5% were here, but I can tell you it's a concern of doctors. Obesity, 58% and 95%. Blindness, hip fracture, and alcoholism. And interestingly, you also had discordant opinions about ingestions, okay? So for example, 26% of you thought that smoking 4 packs a day was a disease, but more of you thought that cocaine addiction was a disease. I'm wondering why. What's the difference between that? Alcoholism, still more of you thought it was a disease, as many as thought that lead poisoning was a disease. And when you come to these conditions, 99% of you thought that lung cancer was a disease, even though only 26% of you thought that smoking 4 packs a day was a disease. Cocaine overdose, 48%. Hangover, 8%. So 68% of you thought that drinking a lot was a disease, but suffering the consequences, only 8% thought. And Tylenol overdose, 31% of you thought it was a disease, and so forth. And so you varied. Now, why do you think you guys had different opinions about this? What were some of the reasons that different ones of you? What are some of the ways in which these conditions vary?
There can be a bias due to the way that things are worded, such as smoking 4 packs a day sounds much more neutral than, say, like lung cancer, which we already know has something detrimental attached to it, but smoking 4 packs a day, that's just something that you say matter-of-factly, and it's up to you to determine whether that's a lot or not.
Okay, so you're thinking that maybe you're kind of turning this argument I'm making inward upon itself and saying, well, Nicholas, even the way you describe it could influence people's perceptions. But let's say that I could have described it in some more neutral way, and you still had these kinds of results. What other kinds of things might explain the differences? Yeah?
Sure. I mean, there's also like the sense of agency attached to each thing.
Yes.
Well, smoking 4 packs a day would be like a person's willing to do that, whereas lung cancer is not something people usually control.
Yes, or even better, to punch your point home, the difference between smoking 4 packs a day and lead poisoning, right? You don't willingly poison yourself with lead. So because we think the agency is less with the lead poisoning, maybe we give that the status of being a disease, right? So whether we label something a disease seems to capture some other attribute of our society, namely the voluntariness of the condition, our perceptions about how voluntary it is. Very good. Other ideas? Yeah.
I put back and forth on defining disease and also concerned doctors.
Uh-huh.
Like right now, I don't even remember how I put it on.
Okay.
The arbitrariness.
You're proving my point, but good, yeah. Okay, so, yeah, in the back there? Yes, that's right. The acuity seems to matter versus the chronicity. So we make different distinctions according to whether it's acute or chronic in our perceptions of something. So, for example, that distinction might be drawn by cocaine, well, actually, there's not a lot of difference between cocaine addiction and cocaine overdose, but maybe something about like alcoholism versus hangover, for example. A sustained use of alcohol, that's a disease, but a one-time kind of hangover problem, maybe that's not, for example. That's right. And other things seem to matter too, like the risk of death seems to matter, cause and effect seem to matter, smoking versus lung cancer. So all these axes, voluntariness, acuity, deadliness, causality, all those things seem to influence how we partition the things that could affect our bodies and label them, this is a disease and this is not. Yeah?
I also thought there was a question about, again, the language about what exactly we're talking about in terms of disease. I mean, in terms of the cocaine overdose versus cocaine addiction.
Yes.
Right, I mean, the overdose, in theory, you're about to die. So in that sense, it's a disease. But when we think about disease, we think of things like the flu, which is not...
So you don't think things that are about to kill you might be diseases?
It's not what I think. I'm saying that the disease, the definition of disease that
Very good.
one of us might have may have something to do
Yes.
with a biological alternative or a biological form as opposed to
Yes.
you're about to actually have a severe health problem.
Yes. And in fact, when we made up this little survey, we deliberately used a concern of doctors and disease to leave that kind of stuff ambiguous to elicit in you guys these kinds of thoughts that we're having. And I want you'll probably be discussing this in section. And the social construction issue also touches on the debate about medicalization, which we discussed a couple of weeks ago and which we will return to when we discuss Illich. And it's interesting which problems you guys thought doctors should concern themselves with and which you thought not. So for example, here's what you thought about global warming. 5% of you thought it was a disease. 21% of you thought doctors should be concerned about it. Nuclear war, 2% thought it was a disease. Only 25% of you thought doctors should be concerned about that. Sadness, 4%, 34%. Compulsive gambling, 40%, 36%. Poverty, 6% of you thought it was a disease. 40% a concern of doctors. I'm really hoping to move this needle by the end of the class. Obesity, malnutrition, depression. And here for benchmarking is hemorrhoids. I really find it astonishing that 71% of you thought that hemorrhoids are a disease, but only 6% of you thought that poverty. I can tell you right now, poverty kills the most people on the planet. The leading killer is poverty. And yet you guys are more concerned with hemorrhoids. And 40% of you think doctors should be concerned about poverty, and 94% with hemorrhoids. So your priorities are effed up, okay? As far as I'm concerned. This is relevant because how we partition these things affects, how we see things and how we intervene in them. So the social construction of illness can in turn also lead to medicalization, which is another important idea. And this process involves, the process of medicalization involves seeing doctors for progressively less serious conditions, seeing doctors for non-medical conditions, or the redefinition of such conditions to be under the purview of doctors, or seeing doctors for normal parts of life experience. So as usual in this class, there's a kind of tension in the way I see things. Because just in the last slide I said, poverty, we should see it as a disease, and doctors should be really concerned about it. And now I'm telling you, isn't it ridiculous that we're increasingly medicalizing so many aspects of human experience, and we're going to redefine poverty as disease? What's that to do with? Okay? So I'm not giving you an answer. I'm just showing you the problems in how we see these things, how we define them, and why it matters. And by some accounts, there's an epidemic of medicalization in our society. There can, in fact, be a kind of social iatrogenesis, which we will discuss later in the class. And here's a list of some conditions that have recently been medicalized. We understand all of these things increasingly in medical terms, whereas formerly we may have understood them as non-medical problems. So for example, PMS, erectile dysfunction didn't used to be seen as a medical problem until we started having treatments for it. Baldness, short stature, acne. In my father's generation, acne was seen as a mark of masturbation or sin, right? It wasn't seen as it was seen as a moral failing, Infertility, road rage, child abuse used to be seen as a crime and a sin, but not like a disease necessarily. Substance abuse, gambling was definitely seen as a sin. Now, you can go to Gamblers Anonymous and get therapy for it. Poverty and gun violence. And as I already mentioned, I'm a little bit, have some tension here because I am going to be arguing that physicians and public health advocates should be concerned with many of the things on this list and that we could see them in medical lenses, even as at the same time I'm kind of quizzically deploring the kind of progressive annexation of not illness into illness. So let's turn now to childbirth. 2% of you thought that it was a disease state. And 92% of you thought it was a concern of doctors. Now, as Martin argues, notions of production run rife in this event, as in the others that she considered. So when a mom is having a baby, the pituitary gland is producing the hormones FSH and LH, the ovary is producing estrogen and progesterone in eggs, the uterus is producing lining and babies, but not menses, and all the while, hormones, eggs, embryos, menses, babies are all being transported from one place to another in an elaborate kind of production of a baby. And as such, menstruation and menopause are seen as failures of production and therefore elicit negative views. In fact, menstruation is not just seen as the failure to produce a baby, but as production gone awry, making products of no use, not to specification, wasted. And labor during childbirth can also be seen as failing. A woman may be seen as failing to progress and as merely participating in a production process that must be monitored and managed. The way of seeing the body, this way of seeing the body, of seeing the delivery of a baby as a production process, or of menstruation as a production process, has consequences. Because when we come to see it that way, when we define it that way, when we use words to socially construct it in this way, it affects our actions. Women can become disconnected from their bodies can become fragmented, and doctors can intervene. So for example, here's a woman that's having a baby today. Here's what's happening now. She's about to have the baby. Do you guys see any problems with this picture? What's going on in this picture? No one's looking at the mom. Where are they looking? Probably a monitor, monitoring the fluids and stuff like that. Do you think the mom is really engaged with the birth of her baby? Yeah, it doesn't. Maybe. I don't think this mom is right now engaged in the birth of her baby. And here's the baby actually now about to be born. And as Martin points out, the delivery can be mapped as a kind of production process. And this is a different flow diagram than one in your book, although it's also taken from a medical source. And the mere fact that there are such flow diagrams is itself interesting and suggestive. Even in the pre-delivery phase has a flow diagram where the pregnancy must be managed. So we're about to have a baby. Prepare for pregnancy. Conception. Suspected pregnancy. Confirmed pregnancy. Manage pregnancy. And now it's time, even before we get to labor and delivery, we are managing the pregnancy. Now we need to go to labor and delivery, and we enter this whole complex mess. Labor and delivery. So here's a planned vaginal birth, and if you have a planned vaginal birth and you go into spontaneous labor and you have routine progress, then you can have a vaginal birth. This nice little yellow path. Otherwise, a complete disaster. So you go to spontaneous labor, failure to progress, you need augmentation. If it worked, you get vaginal birth. Otherwise, C-section. Or you can have emergent complications, then you get a C-section. Or you could have induced labor. If you're lucky and you have routine progress, you get vaginal birth. Otherwise, you have failure to progress, C-section. Or you have emergent complications, C-section. Or you have a planned C-section, C-section. So basically, this vision, this understanding of pregnancy as a production process results in the medical system adopting a set of practices, intervening in a woman's body and intervening in this normal event in this particular way. So our ideas about what delivery is like, our social construction of this biological experience have implications, lead us to take action, like doing all the things on this chart, precisely because we define concepts like normal labor or failure to progress. And there may be nothing objective about these landmarks at all. They may be socially constructed out of thin air with no evidence base whatsoever. And here's some images from your readings regarding a woman undergoing a C-section, just so you get a sense of what that involved. Here they cut open the abdominal wall. They use these huge retractors. It's very difficult, actually. Your skin is like leather. It's very tough to pull it open, actually, to hold these, to be a stick handler or a stick jockey, to pull these things back. And here's the baby that's emerging now from the woman's abdominal cavity. Here the baby, there's a lot of people attending the birth of this baby. The mom is on the right. The baby's been moved to the little bassinet on the left. And now they're closing back up the incision through which they delivered the baby. Now, contrast all that we have just seen with the following. So imagine if we reverse the genders. If your husband was told that he had to get an erection and ejaculate within a certain time or he'd be castrated, do you think that would be easy? To make it easier, perhaps he could have an IV put into his arm, be kept in one position, have straps placed around his penis, and be told not to move. He could be checked every few minutes. The sheet could be lifted to see if any progress had been made. Right? I mean, this seems preposterous to us, that this type of normal process would be subject to this kind of intervention. And as Martin notes on page 58 of your book, this strikes us as ridiculous. Yet, as she also documents, women in labor are often put in structurally analogous positions. Now, I'm a doctor, and all this stuff seems fairly mundane to me, and I've tried to show you only tame and reasonably discrete images today, but there are some more pictures in Martin's book, of course, and on the internet that can give you an idea of how mechanized and dehumanized the process can truly be. And here's another, let me give you yet another example of the consequences of the way we socially construct childbirth. So we are now in the realm of how we define this normal physiological process. It's not, guys, it's not like what you thought in high school, that you look under the microscope and you see the endometrial lining in slides and you just describe it, right? There's nothing objective about that. Well, there is some objective things, but there is also a lot of subjective components to that process where you describe what's happening at the histological level, for example. And then having done all of that, then it affects a variety of things. So here's another thing. Episiotomy is an incision that is made in the perineum from the vagina towards the anus during vaginal delivery. And episiotomy is, so what you do in this situation is because you want to prevent the woman from tearing, and a significant fraction of women tear when they deliver this big head of the baby out of the vagina, and so it was thought that you didn't want the baby, you didn't want these tears, and so it seemed rational, well, why don't we just, to prevent the tear, why don't we just snip her, and with a nice clean line, and that'll let the baby out, and she won't tear. And eventually they learned not to do a midline episiotomy towards the anus, because that caused all kinds of other problems, so they do a medial-lateral episiotomy on this side. And episiotomy was previously believed to prevent tearing of the vagina, as well as damage to the pelvic floor, and it became a routine procedure in the United States for nearly a century. Roughly half of American women have this done to them at delivery. Most of your mothers, if you were born in this country, had this done to them. However, in the past decade, studies have provided strong evidence that postpartum pain is less with spontaneous lacerations than with episiotomy. And studies have also shown that women return to sexual functioning earlier with intact perineums, that's the name for that part of the anatomy, like between the vagina and the anus, and fewer they have returned to normal sexual functioning with intact perineums sooner with spontaneous tears compared to when they had an episiotomy. And the belief that episiotomy prevents damage to the pelvic floor has not been substantiated. In fact, midline episiotomy significantly increases the risk of anal sphincter laceration, predisposing women to subsequent fecal incontinence. And I suggest that one of the reasons that episiotomy became so common is that our views of women's bodies as machines producing a baby. You know, the machine is not producing the baby as specified in the right schedule, in the right way, so we need to take our tools and adjust the machine to produce the baby in this kind of managed production process. And so the machine, therefore, needed some kind of engineering and modifications so that the baby could come out on schedule. And further evidence for the social construction of the need for episiotomy comes from its telling variability. Women who deliver their babies attended by physicians in private practice, where the doctor gets paid for the episiotomy, undergo episiotomies 67% of the time, compared to women attended by hospital faculty physicians who are just paid a salary. They don't get extra money for the procedure. They have episiotomies 18% of the time. And there's also very large international variation, with some wealthy countries having an 8% rate and others having a nearly 100% rate. So this medical procedure is not objective. it's got nothing to do with what's happening to the woman or to the biological process, but rather to do with our perception, our construction of what counts as normal and necessary. Now, just as there has recently been an interest or a resurgent interest in natural death over the last 30 years, as we're going to discuss next week, there's also been a resurgent interest in natural childbirth. And Martin discusses this at length, and you're going to find a lot more pictures in the book there. But note the difference between this image of a woman delivering a baby and the other one. What's happening here? What's different? Standing up, okay? It's much easier to deliver a baby when you have gravity working with you than when you're lying on your back. What else is happening here? Everyone's touching her. Very good. What else? Family, well, they're family members, yeah, present. Who do you think the dad is? And what's he doing? He's praying, and it's okay. And what else is happening in the image? They're looking at her. Yeah, everyone's looking at her. They're touching her. They're helping her. She's standing up. It's a completely different experience. And in fact, this way of delivering babies is atavistic. And it's been the mode of delivering babies since time immemorial. So our rediscovery of standing up to deliver babies, here is a petroglyph from from Australia. Here's something from ancient Egypt. This is another image from Australia. This is a medieval woodcutting. There are these little birthing stools where the woman could sit. They have a hole cut out of the bottom, and here are her legs. Here's the midwife. The baby would fall through the bottom of the stool, and much easier to deliver a baby in this fashion. Now, so the point is that conceptual models affect treatment, and there are many examples of this outside women's health and plastic surgery. So today we discussed women's health and plastic surgery as our medical examples of ways our definitions, and there are many others. For example, for years we thought that ulcers were due to stress. And because of this conceptual model, we didn't consider an alternative for which someone won the Nobel Prize for defining that ulcers actually were due to Helicobacter pylori. A bacterium causes ulcers, not stress. And it used to be thought that, if you're stressed, that's what causes ulcers. Or when I was in medical school, we used to monitor patients after they had a heart attack, and on their EKGs, periodically we would see these extra blips, which were called premature ventricular contractions. And we were taught, this is bad, we have to suppress this. So we had to give these patients medicines to suppress this in the lidocaine class, and we did this, and then someone came along and did a big study and found that actually we were killing the patients by administering these medications. They offered no benefit, and they were harming patients. So because of our definition and our conception of what counted as aberrant or diseased, namely having PVCs, we act on the patient's body and we give him or her medicine, and that medicine doesn't help them but harms them. Or radical mastectomy is another famous story where we had visions or understandings of the process that led for decades women to undergo radical mastectomy, even though more breast-conserving surgery might be beneficial. And there's still other metaphors other than the production metaphor. Martin's subsequent book looked at the immunological metaphors where we look at the body as a fortress or under attack or subject to violence from germs that are attacking it. And all these metaphoric ways of understanding our immune system, which are not objective, lead doctors to act in particular ways. Now, I need to close by being very, very clear about something else which may have escaped some of you over the course of the talk. Because it is not the case that modern healthcare is not beneficial and that all we need to do is to return to some kind of natural time or place of childbirth. And here's some devastating WHO statistics. This is maternal mortality by region in the year 2000. So this is the number of women who die per 100,000 live births. So worldwide it's 400, but in sub-Saharan Africa, 1,000 out of 100,000 women. So 1% of women, 1% of the babies that are born in sub-Saharan Africa, the mother dies while delivering that baby. And in other parts of the world, like in contemporary Afghanistan, it's even higher. And you can see the statistics around the world here. So it's not the case that all we need to do is to return to some kind of natural childbirth, that's all we want. Natural childbirth is natural, but it can be deadly. So how do we strike the balance? How do we get the right note? The WHO's Safe Motherhood Initiative regarding the provision of basic health care in this domain unfortunately failed. So the WHO tried a worldwide initiative to improve the abysmal state of these statistics, and And in fact, a certain small percentage of women need serious advanced medical care on short notice. Maternal mortality in Africa is shockingly high, for example, and the challenge is to separate the social construction, what is socially constructed, from what is scientifically beneficial. And in a way, the challenge of being a doctor is to know when to respond to the statistical, when to the normative, and when to the adaptive standard of health. So my point is not to somehow simplify things in a silly way and to say that the fact that these things are socially constructed means that there's no science or medicine, or to put these concepts between social construction and science and medicine into opposition. Unfortunately, it's not so simple. It's not like that. And there are other sorts of leading causes of maternal death worldwide. So this is the cause of maternal death worldwide. 25% of the women die due to severe bleeding, 15% due to infection, 13% due to unsafe abortion, 12% due to eclampsia, 8% due to obstructed labor. This always struck me as a haunting and devastating way to die when women are buried, with a fetus stuck in the pelvis and we find their skeletons thousands of years later. You can just imagine the experience of that woman. Other direct causes, and 20% from indirect causes. And these kinds of problems don't respond to our just redefining them away or labeling them as natural. And they don't respond to midwives with kits. Nor should we define them as non-problems because they're natural. They can indeed be prevented with low-cost interventions, such as reducing infection or unsafe abortions, but we cannot eliminate them completely. And so, what's challenging about what I'm telling you today is that these things are complex. The Martin critique is one of the best, and in fact is spot on in my opinion. But I want to challenge you even more because there's also a reality of maternal and fetal death. And what we want, in fact, is the best of both worlds. And we should be able to have it as far as I'm concerned. And that's, in fact, what's so hard about being a doctor. You are really trying to integrate what is scientifically sound and what is human. And you don't always know what is right. And information is conditional and tentative and changing all the time. Thank you.